Shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Hey guys, Spirit of the Lie here. In this deep dive, we're going to be taking a look at the Saracens' unique unit, the Mameluke. Now they have a bit of a polarizing reputation. On the one hand, it's traditionally been a target of criticism for being expensive and easy to counter. On the other hand, its proponents say, yes, they're expensive, but that's because they're really good, and not so easy to counter these days after some recent changes. In this video, we're going to take a deeper look at where they stand today and see how they measure up against various types of units. To give some important context, if you're in and out of AoE2 and not following every single change, Mamelukes had an important update a year ago to their armor class, removing archer armor, meaning anti-archer units no longer deal bonus damage against them. Saracens also had a unique tech zealotry, which added HP to their camels, including Mamelukes, that at one point cost a whopping 750 food and 700 gold, which is now essentially given for free. So the criticism it's an expensive unit to tech into feels somewhat dated, especially considering it actually has one of the cheaper elite upgrades. Clearly, we should go into this with an open mind. So with that, let's start off by looking at their stats. Right away, notice in many ways they seem to split the difference between camel riders and cavalry archers, having a blend of their HP, armor, and range. At the same time, they have more attack than either, and that's also melee damage, just like camels. Now, some parts of that comparison might make you think of the Berber's camel archer. However, I don't love that comparison, as that unit is really specialized against very different things, being anti-cavalry archer, whereas the Mameluke is much more of an anti-cavalry specialist. Notice as well their very short 3 range, which can't be upgraded, making them outranged by any archer, even without fletching, to the point it maybe feels more like a mounted, slightly longer range camel than a true cavalry archer. And the fact they do melee damage and are anti-cavalry also fits in with that. Now one area they do stand out is in their cost, needing significantly more gold than the other two. There's no question you're paying a premium for the unit, with only some siege, ships, and monks costing more gold. Going a bit deeper under the hood, their main bonus to know is they have +9 or +12 against cavalry, which includes anything on a horse or elephant. The big exception is, maybe surprisingly, there's no attack bonus against camels, which is particularly significant because camels in return do have an attack bonus against Mamelukes. The other things to watch out for besides camels are any sort of spear unit, as well as a few odd ones here and there that either counter mounted or unique units, as well as defensive buildings like towers, town centers, and castles, as a legacy bonus they still have from when camels were considered naval units in the game. Also, maybe not completely intuitive are the Mamelukes upgrades, where despite being a ranged unit, the usual ranged blacksmith upgrades, ballistics, and chemistry all have no effect. Instead, you probably want to think of them as a camel rider, benefiting from bloodlines, husbandry, the cavalry blacksmith upgrades, plus obviously their elite upgrade at the castle. That elite upgrade is actually pretty important, and for 600 food and 500 gold gives you more HP, attack, bonus against cavalry, melee armor, and a shorter attack delay, making them easier to micro, which we'll see can be critical to getting the most out of them. Also, while on the topic of micro and hit and run, it turns out they're relatively fast, the same as a cavalry archer, and faster than knights, though technically a little slower than the camel rider, and definitely slower than the hussar. Of course, as a unique castle unit, you always have to be conscious of their training time, which it turns out closely mirrors the camel rider and is much faster than cavalry archers, for example. Considering they're by far the most gold intensive of these three though, that can make them a little tricky to use in 1v1 Arabia, ironically considering it's the region they historically come from, simply because it's a bit of an investment to build up their numbers and also costs you some potential trebuchets. One last point when discussing the castle is, since they deal melee damage, they don't actually add any extra arrows to castles, in case you're wondering, with again a comparison to camel riders being an easy way to remember that. So that's a quick overview and crash course on the unit, and now let's try them out in a few different matchups. Remember, for all of this, costing a lot of gold and needing castles to train means we don't really want to be taking balanced fights here resource-wise. I'm also going to play around a bit with having them stand ground versus hit and run with a bit of stop micro to show how much of a difference that can make. One last thing to keep in mind is that the main focus here is going to be on the Imperial Age, as that's usually when you encounter them, especially in team games. But I'll also touch on a few important Castle Age matchups here and there as well, so we have lots to look at. We'll start though with their specialty, which is of course cavalry. Just going with a simple Castle Age test against Knights with all upgrades, 10 vs 10, both sides cost roughly the same total resources, and Mamelukes hold up great, ending with 63% of their HP left, even without lifting a finger to micro. Of course, we can make that look even better with just some simple stop micro, and given Mamelukes are technically a little faster than Knights, you can essentially end up with no damage taken, as long as you have the space to maneuver. It's a pretty similar story in the Imperial Age against Paladins as well, ending a straight 10 on 10 fight with over half their HP left over. Again, micro helps them shine even more, and is pretty simple to do with a hotkey for the stop command, feeling particularly smooth given the elite Mamelukes' unusually short attack delay. Similar to Castle Age, ending with 90% or more of your HP left is pretty easy to do if a small group of Paladins can be convinced to chase you. Remember, Saracens have the regular heavy camel though, as a cheaper alternative, so are Mamelukes doing better or worse than those in a similar fight? Well, it turns out Mamelukes might be even a little better, even without micro. Here, with balanced resources 13 versus 11, Castle Age camels end with less HP than Mamelukes did just standing still. In Imperial Age, they end up basically performing the same. So while this is a way to save a bit of gold, the point is Mamelukes, even without micro, are seemingly doing just as well as camels against the knight line. That isn't necessarily true against all cavalry though, as if we throw them against double their numbers of Hussar, the Mamelukes do okay, with about half their HP left. In this case, swapping out an equal value worth of Saracen heavy camels though, remembering they have slightly more HP than usual, end up with a more impressive 2/3 of their strength left. That doesn't include any sort of micro for the Mameluke, but the point is that camels in some cases will still give better value. Where things get spicy is when we look at the two head-to-head, and Saracen camels in this case directly against Mamelukes is extremely one-sided for the camels, given they have bonus damage happening here and the Mamelukes don't. This is also a matchup where it's hard to micro, as camel riders are the slightly faster of the two, making this actually one of the worst matchups we'll see from the Mamelukes' perspective. And one final cavalry unit to consider is of course elephants, including war or battle elephants. This is definitely one to take the time to micro, though remember elite Mamelukes have plus 12 bonus damage applying here, and given their speed and range makes this a pretty comfortable matchup with some attention. So that's cavalry, where as long as they aren't against camels, Mamelukes so far do pretty great, particularly with some micro. Moving on now to infantry, this is if anything even more micro dependent. While camels usually take less bonus damage from spear units than most cavalry, don't let that lull you into a false sense of security, as this is definitely not a matchup where you want to stand and fight, with halberdiers not just costing no gold, but getting very one-sided results with balanced resources. On the other hand, with hit and run and enough space, halberdiers can never land a hit, giving one of those situations where you could argue either unit counters the other. I'd still call them a major threat, but with micro is a threat that can be managed. Now, Eagle Warriors are an interesting case, as they're almost fast enough to keep up, and given their cheap cost and +2 bonus against camels, can be made to look like a pretty solid counter. Again though, I'd argue this all comes down to micro, as even outnumbered 2-to-1 by Eagles, 10 Mamelukes can pretty easily win if they have enough space to work with. The melee damage here bypassing the Eagle Warrior's high pierce armor and very short attack delay at least make Eagles much easier to handle than cavalry archers trying the same approach. Another interesting matchup to highlight for Mamelukes is of course the Gbeto and throwing Axemen, as the other ranged melee units. It turns out with balanced resources, both of those deal with Mamelukes just fine, mostly because of Lanchester's square law, meaning greater numbers win the day, though they both also outrange it as well. So this is a case where micro doesn't save a Saracen player. The last infantry I want to touch on is the elite Teutonic Knight, where while you technically counter them with unlimited micro, your projectiles are dealing 1 damage each. So again, you could argue either one situationally counters the other, similar to halberdiers. So far though, Mamelukes are looking pretty good against both cavalry and the majority of infantry they encounter. But now let's get to one of their main struggles, which is of course archers. To start with the arbalester, this isn't actually as bad as you might expect based on the Mameluke's low pierce armor, and without micro, I found it can be surprisingly close to an even trade. Obviously, arbalesters outrange them, and if there's unit traffic in between, that might make it hard for the Mamelukes to get close enough. But in a straight shootout like this, the Mameluke isn't getting completely destroyed. In fact, if we take away Bracer from the arbalesters, elite Mamelukes can in fact trade reasonably well. I would say the arbalester counters Mameluke narrative has specific civilizations or situations in mind to hold up, as arbalesters, especially missing upgrades, won't necessarily take a good fight if they're caught in the open. Of course, this is also the first case we've seen where it's not the Mameluke, but instead the opponent who benefits from a little hit and run, giving the arbalesters greater range. Now, one archer unit worth highlighting in particular, I think, is the Genoese Crossbow, with some bonus damage against camels. This is just to point out that this fight is absolutely one you want no part of as a Saracen player, as both your Mamelukes and any camel riders you have will just melt against them. Next up though, let's take a look at skirmishers. A couple of years ago, I would have said this is another dangerous matchup for Mamelukes, but of course they no longer take bonus damage here, while in return bypass the elite skirmishers' pierce armor. In fact, these days skirmishers just get wrecked, which for those keeping track means Mamelukes, at least with micro, are a pretty solid all-around anti-trash unit, assuming you have the gold to produce them. Next up, hand cannoneers are another unit you might be worried about, and technically outrange Mamelukes a fair bit, but are slow enough they can't really hit and run, and also go down pretty quickly. They put up a better fight than skirmishers, but ultimately don't seem that intimidating, at least without a solid meat shield in front. Another unit you might wonder about is the cavalry archer. Mamelukes, of course, have a big bonus at play here, letting them actually win with over half their HP left in a balanced fight. This is the best way to take that engagement with Mamelukes, as you're obviously outranged, so trying to micro doesn't really make any sense, or you're just constantly taking pot shots. Instead, it's the cavalry archers in a position to use their range and speed to micro, and especially when you have a critical mass are probably best to avoid with Mamelukes altogether. Trying it out with balanced resources on a smaller scale though, I actually couldn't win with a group of generic heavy cavalry archers against Mamelukes. I'm not saying it's impossible with enough tries, or you can't find a cavalry archer unique unit you could do it with, but in the long run, the pressure is really on the cavalry archer player in this matchup to be hiding under castles or escaping before it turns into a head-to-head fight. And finally, to close the book on archers, we should really consider the elephant archer. Again, since they outrange Mamelukes, the best a Saracen player can hope for is a stand-and-fight situation. Even with that ideal setup though, the elephant archer looks to have the edge, here with a group of Dravidian elephant archers. There is some bonus damage going on here, but this is the kind of thing elephant archers are built for, and they hold up pretty well. But now to end with a few other miscellaneous units you might encounter, while the Mamelukes' melee damage makes them particularly good against rams, and on paper deal a lot more damage than most ranged units against scorpions or onagers, their short range makes those dubious matchups. They can take a direct siege onager hit, but considering their lack of range and high gold cost, I actually think both scorpions and onagers should be considered a soft counter to Mamelukes. Similarly, monks can also exploit their short range and high cost. A monk with Sanctity, for example, has a pretty good chance of surviving to make a conversion, and as Saracens, keep the new tech Devotion in mind if a player is using a lot of monks to try and counter your early Mamelukes. Buildings are another interesting case, where you want to remember Mamelukes' melee damage lets them do much better than most ranged units, even Saracen arbalesters for example, despite their team bonus. A great ally here would be the Hindustanis, letting your camels do even more against buildings, and naturally affects Mamelukes. The one caveat around buildings is you take that slight extra bonus damage from towers, town centers, and castles, and on top of Mamelukes' low pierce armor and short range makes them less ideally suited for raiding than cavalry archers for example. But to close with some final thoughts, overall it's an expensive but pretty impressive unit. They pair well with siege and especially a meat shield, with Mamelukes performing as an intermediate range support unit that hold up unusually well against skirmishers and most cavalry. Hussar are probably the most obvious pairing in front to give them some protection, given Mamelukes cost so much gold, though skirmishers can also pair pretty well to help deal with spears or enemy arbalesters cost effectively. On paper, you could also argue pairing with camels or cavalry archers makes some sense as well, though it leads to very gold-intensive armies and have a lot of overlapping weaknesses, given, as we saw at the start, the Mameluke is already a bit of a blend of those two. Don't forget Saracens have some pretty decent monks as well, which can passively heal nearby units all at once, preserving those very pricey Mamelukes. Speaking of which though, if you're a big fan of passive income, you should think about opening an online website with this video's sponsor Squarespace. Where websites traditionally take a lot of technical knowledge to set up and maintain, Squarespace is a tool to help you create a professional looking site within minutes. If you're a blogger, own a small business, or chasing the passive income dream of opening an online store, but have no idea how to make a functional website from scratch, Squarespace has you covered with templates and tools to help you out, simplifying the website building process. Squarespace even has great third-party extensions to handle things like inventory, taxes, shipping, and scheduling to accommodate your specific needs. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/spiritofthelaw to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So that's a look at the Saracen's pretty impressive unique unit, and hopefully puts them in a bit of context next time you think about using or if you run into them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.